The taste of copper filled Morningstar's mouth as she pressed her bloodied palm against the canyon wall, her lungs burning from the chase through razor-sharp stone passages. Behind her, Vasquez's voice echoed off the rocks like the howl of a wounded animal growing closer with each heartbeat. "Come out, girl. You cannot run forever in this stone prison." Her blue eyes swept the narrow ledge where she had cornered herself, searching for escape routes that didn't exist. 30 feet below, Thomas lay motionless beside an overturned boulder, crimson seeping into the sand from a gash across his temple. Across the chasm, hawk feather hung suspended from a rope around his wrists, his unconscious form dangling over jagged rocks that would crush him if the fraying fibers snapped. The choice crystallized with brutal clarity. She could save one, but not both. Morningstar's fingers tightened around the handle of Captain Caldwell's saber, the steel still warm from the blood of the soldiers she had killed to reach this moment. The Comanche war paint streaking her cheeks blue and white stripes that marked her as both healer and warrior could not hide the tracks where tears had carved clean paths through dust and desperation. In the distance, smoke billowed from Fort Brazos, where the sacred spring ran red with the blood of 2 families, and where the man who had orchestrated 15 years of lies finally lay dead by her hand. But victory tasted like ashes when it came at the cost of choosing which brother would die. She closed her eyes and remembered her adoptive father's final words. "The strength of 2 worlds lives in your heart, daughter. When the moment comes, let that strength choose for you." The sound of falling rock announced Vasquez's approach. Morningstar opened her eyes, raised the bloodied saber, and made her choice. 3 summers of drought had transformed the Comanche hunting grounds into a wasteland where bleached bones marked the graves of buffalo herds, and the wind sang funeral songs through empty villages. Morningstar knelt beside the sacred spring as dawn painted the eastern sky, the color of fresh blood, her reflection wavering in black water that had become the lifeline for Chief Broken Arrow's band of 43 survivors. At 20, she moved with the predatory grace of someone raised by warriors, her long blonde braids adorned with eagle feathers that caught the morning light like captured sunbeams. The intricate beadwork decorating her doe-skin dress told the story of her unique position. Comanche symbols woven together with patterns that spoke of the white world she had been born into before raiders claimed her family and left her an orphan among enemies who became her salvation. Each day brings us closer to the choice no parent should face. Singing Wolf murmured as she filled clay vessels with water that looked clean but tasted of desperation. Her weathered hands moved with the efficiency of someone who had performed this ritual through seasons of plenty, and want though now each precious drop represented the difference between survival and watching their children die of thirst. Morningstar studied her adoptive mother's profile, noting the new lines that grief had carved around her eyes. Father speaks of approaching the fort again, another attempt at negotiation with the new captain. Singing Wolf's voice carried no optimism. Perhaps this one will prove different from the others. The bitter laugh that escaped Morningstar's lips held 15 years of broken promises and dashed hopes. She had served as translator during every negotiation with the commanders of Fort Brazos, watching each successive officer grow more demanding as desperation made the Comanche appear weaker. The latest ultimatum had been delivered with cavalry sabers and rifle threats: surrender to the reservation or face extermination. Different how, by killing us with kindness before he ships us to die slowly in Indian territory. Before Singing Wolf could respond, the thunder of approaching hooves shattered the morning stillness. Morningstar rose in one fluid motion, her hand instinctively finding the knife at her belt as a cavalry column emerged from the heat haze. At their head rode a man she had never seen, broad-shouldered and gray-haired with winter storm eyes that seemed to carry secrets heavier than his military bearing could support. Captain James Caldwell surveyed the small camp with the calculating gaze of someone accustomed to evaluating threats and opportunities. But when his attention settled on Morningstar, something flickered across his features that looked disturbingly like recognition tinged with guilt. Time to discover what manner of devil wears blue today. Morning Star whispered, though something cold in her chest suggested this particular devil might prove more dangerous than any who had come before. The sun climbed toward its merciless zenith as Chief Broken Arrow led his delegation across the hardpan desert toward the meeting ground, a stretch of neutral territory between the Sprung and Fort Brazos, where previous negotiations had died beneath the weight of impossible demands. Morning Star rode at his right hand, her painted pony stepping carefully around scattered bones that served as monuments to other failed conferences. 3 of their most respected warriors flanked them, though everyone understood that these talks represented surrender disguised as diplomacy. The white cloth tied to Broken Arrow's lance snapped in the hot wind like a flag of defeat they weren't ready to acknowledge. Captain Caldwell waited with military precision, his escort arranged in parade formation beside their horses. As the distance closed, Morning Star found herself studying the man who would determine whether her people lived or died. Unlike previous commanders who had relied on bluster and threats, Caldwell stood quietly, his weathered face unreadable, except for the way his eyes kept returning to scan their small party, as if searching for something specific. "Chief Broken Arrow," Caldwell said as the Comanche delegation halted 20 feet away. His voice carried the rasp of someone who had shouted orders across too many battlefields. "I am Captain James Caldwell. I've been sent to discuss the final terms for your people's relocation." The word "final" hung in the desert air like a death sentence. Broken Arrow remained mounted, his dignity intact, despite the desperate circumstances that had forced this meeting. "I am Broken Arrow, War Chief of the Noconi Comanche. We come to discuss water rights to the sacred spring of our ancestors. We do not come to discuss surrender." Morning Star watched the exchange with trained attention, noting subtle details that might provide leverage or reveal weakness. When Caldwell's gaze settled on her again, she felt an odd chill. Not the assessment of a military threat, but something more personal and infinitely more dangerous. "Chief, the spring lies within territorial boundaries controlled by Fort Brazos." Caldwell replied, his fingers drumming against his leg in a nervous rhythm that didn't match his confident tone. "Federal law requires all native tribes to relocate to designated reservations. I have no authority to negotiate water rights." "We Noxter." "Then you have no authority to deny what has belonged to my people since the world was young." Broken Arrow responded with quiet steel. "We ask only for what we need to survive until the rains return." Silence stretched between them like a bowstring under tension. Then Caldwell stepped forward, and morning light caught something metallic at his throat, a thin silver chain that disappeared beneath his uniform collar. The movement pulled the chain slightly upward, revealing the edge of what appeared to be a locket. Morning Star's breath stopped in her throat. She had seen that locket before, or one exactly like it in Singing Wolf's careful hands, during quiet evening moments when her adoptive mother thought herself unobserved. Singing Wolf would hold the small silver oval, running her fingers over its engraved surface, while staring into flames with eyes full of old sorrow. "I saved this from the wagon train where we found you." Singing Wolf had explained years ago, when Morning Star finally asked about the mysterious keepsake. "It belonged to your birth mother. Inside is a daguerreotype, your father, though the image has faded. Someday when you're ready to face that part of your past, it will be yours." But here was another locket, identical in every detail, hanging from the neck of a cavalry officer who spoke of relocation, while his eyes held shadows that whispered of personal demons. "Na, Captain," she said, her English crisp, despite the Comanche words that came more naturally. "That locket, where did you acquire it?" Caldwell's hand moved instinctively to his throat, fingers closing around the chain in a gesture that screamed guilt. "It's a personal matter, miss, not relevant to military business. Everything becomes relevant when my people's survival depends on understanding the men who hold our fate." Morning Star replied, dismounting with fluid grace. She stepped forward, blue eyes locked on Caldwell's face like a hunter sighting prey. That locket, I've seen its twin. It belonged to a white woman who died 15 winters ago when Comanche warriors found her infant daughter among burning wagons. Color drained from Caldwell's features as if she had struck him. Behind her, Morning Star heard Broken Arrow's sharp intake of breath, but she pressed forward relentlessly. The infant was me, Captain. And unless I'm very much mistaken, you were there that day. You were there when my birth family died. Caldwell staggered backward, his escort moving to flank him with hands dropping to sidearms. But he waved them off with a gesture that shook like autumn leaves in a storm. How could you possibly? He began, and then stopped, his voice failing completely. For a long moment, he simply stared at Morning Star, winter gray eyes, wide with recognition, and something that might have been fear. When he finally found his voice, it came out as barely more than a whisper. You have your mother's eyes. Dear God in heaven, you have Elizabeth's eyes. The admission struck like lightning across the desert. Morning Star felt 15 years of carefully constructed identity beginning to crack. Tell me what happened that day. Caldwell's hand went to the locket again this time, pulling it free to catch the harsh sunlight. I led the patrol that found the wagon train. We arrived too late. Raiders had already struck. Your parents, your older brother, all dead. But you were there, hidden beneath your mother's body, somehow untouched by the violence. Morning Star's knees nearly buckled. Brother, Thomas Morrison, 7 years old when he disappeared. Caldwell's voice grew stronger, as if confession were lifting some terrible burden. I searched for weeks, but never found his body. I assumed the raiders had taken him, but after 15 years. Before he could finish, the drum of hoofbeats announced new arrivals. A cavalry detachment emerged from the fort's gates, led by a young lieutenant, whose bearing spoke of fresh academy training and untested confidence. As they approached, Morning Star found herself studying the officer's face with desperate intensity. The lieutenant was perhaps 25, with light brown hair and blue eyes that might have matched her own, if not for the hardness that military life had carved around their edges. His jaw was square and determined, his posture rigidly correct, as he saluted Caldwell with parade ground precision. Sir Colonel Henderson's compliments, and he requests an immediate report on negotiations, the lieutenant said crisply. In due time, Lieutenant Morrison. Caldwell replied. The Morning Star felt the world shift beneath her feet. Morrison, Thomas Morrison. Her brother stood 10 feet away, wearing the uniform of their people's oppressor, and he had no idea who she was. Morning Star fought to maintain composure, as Lieutenant Thomas Morrison's gaze swept over their delegation with military efficiency. When his eyes met hers, there was no recognition, only the cold assessment of a potential enemy. The captain. Thomas continued. Colonel Henderson is concerned about the extended timeline. Orders were clear regarding tribal relocation. Caldwell's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Lieutenant, informed the colonel that I'm conducting negotiations as circumstances require. These people face a humanitarian crisis. With respect, sir, these people are in violation of federal law. Thomas replied, his tone professionally respectful while carrying underlying steel. Every day we delay increases the risk of organized resistance. Morning Star watched the exchange with growing horror. Her brother spoke of her people as obstacles to be removed, problems to be solved with force if diplomacy proved inconvenient. 15 years of believing his family was dead had shaped him into the very weapon aimed at his sister's heart. Chief Broken Arrow had remained silent, but now he spoke with dignity that cut through tension like a blade. Captain Caldwell, perhaps we should postpone these talks until you've settled matters with your own war council. No. Morning Star said quickly, stepping forward before either man could respond. We need to discuss this now. Too much depends on what happens here. She moved closer to Thomas, studying features that might have seemed familiar if she looked in a mirror. The shape of his nose, the way his left eyebrow curved slightly higher than his right, a small scar on his chin from some childhood mishap, details that spoke of shared blood and separate lives. "Lieutenant Morrison isn't a common name in these territories," she said carefully. "Have you always served in Texas?" Thomas's expression sharpened with suspicion. "My personal history isn't relevant to military operations. However, since you asked directly, I've served on the frontier for 8 years since graduating West Point. Before that..." He paused, shadows crossing his features. "Before that isn't your concern? Before that you were a child in these lands." Morning Star pressed her heart, hammering. "Before the Army found you and gave you purpose after losing everything that mattered." "Nah, how could you possibly..." Thomas began, then stopped. His hand moved unconsciously to his saber hilt, a defensive gesture that spoke of old wounds. "Because I know what it means to be found by people who aren't your blood," Morning Star said softly. "I know what it means to grow up wondering about the family you lost, creating stories to fill empty spaces where memories should live." Silence stretched electric between them. Caldwell watched with growing understanding, while Broken Arrow observed with the patience of someone who had learned to read currents beneath surface words. Thomas's face had gone pale beneath his campaign tan. "You speak as if you know something about my past, as if you were there when everyone else died." "Thomas," Morning Star said, and the name felt both foreign and utterly familiar. "Thomas Morrison. 7 years old when raiders came. Hidden in your father's root cellar while your family was slaughtered above." The lieutenant staggered as if struck by lightning. His escort moved to steady him, but he waved them off with a sharp gesture, eyes never leaving Morning Star's face. "Impossible," he breathed. "Sarah died with the rest. I searched the ruins when I was old enough, when the Army gave me permission to return. There was nothing left. Sarah..." Tears threatened to spill over. "That was my birth name. She was 2 years old," Thomas said, his voice breaking. "Blonde hair like spun gold, eyes blue as summer sky. She followed me everywhere, always laughing." He pressed palms against his eyes. "She called me Tommy because she couldn't pronounce Thomas." Morning Star took another step forward, close enough to touch him. "Tommy. I remember that name. In dreams sometimes I hear a voice calling for Tommy, and it sounds like my own voice, but younger, frightened." Thomas dropped his hands, staring at her with naked anguish. "If you're really Sarah, then you've been living with the people who killed our parents. You've been raised by murderers." The accusation hit like a physical blow. Behind her, one of the warriors hissed with anger, but Broken Arrow's voice cut through rising tension. "Enough. We didn't come to relitigate old battles. We came to secure water before more children die of thirst." But damage was done. Thomas straightened, military bearing reasserting itself like armor. "Captain Caldwell, if this woman is who she claims, she represents a security risk. She's been living among hostiles, gathering intelligence. She represents no such thing." Caldwell said, though Morning Star caught something calculating in his tone. "She's a victim of circumstances beyond her control. She's a white woman who chose to live as a savage." Thomas replied coldly, "She's betrayed her own race. How can we trust anything she says?" Morning Star felt 15 years of balanced identity crumbling. To the Comanche, she would always be the white foundling with divided loyalties. To the whites, she was now the savage-raised traitor who had forgotten her heritage. She belonged to neither world, and the brothers she just found seemed determined to reject her entirely. "Lieutenant Morrison," she said, drawing herself up with all the dignity Broken Arrow had taught her, "I propose a test. Give me 1 day to prove my adoptive people aren't the monsters you believe them to be." Thomas's laugh was bitter as desert wind. What terms? If I can demonstrate that the Comanche seek only survival until rains return, will you support Captain Caldwell's humanitarian approach? And if you fail? Morning Star met his eyes steadily. Then I'll speak to Chief Broken Arrow about voluntary relocation. It was a desperate gamble with lives she loved as stakes. Thomas considered for a long moment, then nodded curtly. One day. But I want safe passage guarantees, and your word this isn't an elaborate trap. You have my word, Morning Star said solemnly. The word of Sarah Morrison, given to her brother Thomas. As they worked out details, neither noticed Caldwell's calculating expression or the way his hand had moved to rest on his sidearm. The captain had his own plans for tomorrow's events plans that had nothing to do with humanitarian concerns and everything to do with profitable arrangements with certain Mexican businessmen very interested in water rights. Plans that would put Morning Star's brother directly in mortal danger and force her to choose between saving him and saving the people who had given her life meaning when she had nothing else. Dawn was still hours away when Morning Star led Thomas and his nervous escort, Corporal Davies, who jumped at every desert sound toward the Comanche encampment. She had spent the night alternating between preparation and staring at stars while processing the reality of finding her lost brother. The camp lay hidden 3 miles from the spring, sheltered by red sandstone formations that rose like ancient monuments from the desert floor. As they approached, Morning Star could see thin smoke wisps from morning fires and hear quiet sounds of people preparing for another day of uncertain survival. Numbers. Thomas asked his soldiers' instincts, cataloging potential threats. 43, including elderly and children. Morning Star replied, watching for any crack in his professional mask. Hardly the massive war party your Colonel Henderson fears. Thomas studied the camp layout with professional interest. And she wondered if he saw defensive positions or was beginning to understand the desperate poverty that had driven her people to this final sanctuary. Chief Broken Arrow emerged from his lodge as they entered, followed by Singing Wolf and tribal elders. The old chief's greeting was formal, but not hostile, his English careful for Thomas's benefit. Lieutenant Morrison, you are welcome. My daughter has told us of your relationship. It is strange how the spirits bring family together across such distances. Thomas stiffened at being called Broken Arrow's daughter's brother, but managed a respectful nod. Chief, I appreciate your hospitality. I hope today helps us understand each other. As they moved deeper into the camp, Morning Star watched Thomas's face for any sign of the boy she remembered. What she saw was careful observation, noting details, assessing weaknesses, maintaining emotional distance from the human cost of policies he'd been sent to enforce. But there were cracks. When they passed children playing with wooden horses, his step faltered slightly. When an elderly woman coughed violently, her frail body racked by dry air and insufficient water, his jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. These are the fearsome warriors your army fears, Morning Star asked softly, gesturing toward teenage boys practicing with blunted arrows, their movements showing more enthusiasm than skill. Numbers can change quickly, Thomas replied, but his tone lacked conviction. Comanche are known for calling upon allied bands. Thomas, look around you, Morning Star said, stopping in the camp's center. These people are dying. 3 years of drought have pushed them to survival's edge. They're not planning raids, they're deciding whether to surrender their freedom or watch their children die of thirst. She led him to their water supply, 3 large clay vessels containing perhaps 2 days' worth for the entire band. Water levels were visibly low, and what remained was cloudy with sediment from scraping increasingly shallow sources. This is what we have left, she said simply. This is why we must have access to the spring. Thomas stared at the vessels, his professional demeanor cracking as reality penetrated his military conditioning. Why don't they accept relocation? The reservation has adequate water government protection. Because the reservation is slow death. Singing Wolf said, appearing beside Morning Star like shadow given voice. Her English was heavily accented, but clear, each word chosen with precision. We've heard stories from other bands who surrendered. Disease, hunger, corruption among agents who control supplies. Our children would survive the journey only to die of despair in a place that steals souls. Thomas studied Singing Wolf's face, and Morning Star saw something shift in his expression, recognition of strength required to maintain dignity, facing impossible choices. "You raised her," he said quietly. "Not a question. I loved her when she had no one else." Singing Wolf replied with dignity that held no apology. "I taught her our ways, our language, our healing arts. But I also taught her about the world she came from, so she could understand both parts of her heritage. The world where her family was murdered by Comanche raiders." Thomas said, bitterness creeping into his voice. Singing Wolf met his gaze unflinchingly. "The world where children are stolen and families torn apart by violence. Yes, that world exists on both sides, Lieutenant Morrison. Your army has burned Comanche villages, killed Comanche children. The cycle of violence has many fathers." Before Thomas could respond, shouts erupted from the camp's eastern edge. Morning Star turned to see one of their sentries racing toward them, face tight with alarm. "Riders approaching." The sentry called in rapid Comanche. Many riders from the fort's direction, but moving like hunters, not soldiers. Morning Star translated quickly for Thomas, who immediately drew his service revolver. "How many?" The sentry held up both hands twice, then added 3 fingers. 23, maybe more. Moving fast, and their formation is wrong." Thomas cursed with words that would have scandalized his West Point instructors. "More than a patrol. Colonel Henderson may have decided to end negotiations early, or something else is happening," Morning Star said grimly. The sentry's additional hand signals made her blood run cold. The approaching force wasn't flying military colors, and their equipment was too mixed to be regular cavalry. Broken Arrow was already calling orders, sending non-combatants toward hidden passages in the rock formations. The few remaining warriors gathered weapons, but Morning Star could see hopelessness in their movements. Even if every man could fight, they were vastly outnumbered. "Let Thomas," she said urgently, grabbing his arm. "If you want to prove you're not our enemy, help us get the vulnerable to safety." He hesitated, torn between military duty and family loyalty. Then he holstered his revolver and nodded sharply. "Corporal Davies, help organize evacuation. Anyone who can't fight needs to reach cover immediately." As they worked to shepherd people to safety, Morning Star caught glimpses of approaching riders through sandstone gaps. What she saw turned her blood to ice. These weren't regular cavalry. Uniforms were too varied, equipment too eclectic. Some carried military carbines, others older weapons, and their horses showed signs of hard travel. "They're mercenaries," she breathed. "Someone hired them to stage an attack." Thomas had seen it too, face going white with understanding. "Someone wants it to look like the tribe started hostilities. Create excuse for massacre. But who would?" Morning Star began, then stopped as the answer became horribly clear. Caldwell's strange behavior, his reluctance to discuss his past, the calculating look when Thomas proposed this meeting. "We have to warn the others," she said, but it was too late. The fake cavalry had reached the perimeter, and gunfire erupted across the desert morning like thunder announcing the end of the world. The trap had been sprung with military precision, and Morning Star found herself caught between her brother's world and her adopted family's survival, with no clear path to save either and precious little time to figure out which sacrifice would hurt least. Gunfire shattered the morning stillness as the mercenaries swept through the camp with brutal efficiency, Morning Star crouched behind a sandstone outcropping with Thomas and Davies watching helplessly as the attackers scattered the few warriors who tried to resist and systematically destroyed everything that had made this place home. The assault lasted less than 10 minutes, but each second stretched like hours. When silence finally settled over the ruins, it was somehow more terrifying than the violence that had preceded it. Morning Star peered around the rock to assess the devastation. The camp lay in ruins. Lodge poles were broken and scattered like giant bones, their hide coverings slashed and trampled. Clay water vessels lay shattered, their precious contents already soaked into thirsty sand. Bodies dotted the area where moments before there had been life and hope. "Stay here," Thomas whispered, checking his revolver. "I'll try to reach survivors." "No," Morning Star said firmly, grabbing his wrist. "This was planned. Someone wanted you here as a witness." Before Thomas could respond, hoofbeats announced a single rider approaching with casual confidence. Captain Caldwell, his uniform pristine, his face wearing satisfaction that chilled Morning Star to the bone. "Lieutenant Morrison." Caldwell called out, reining in his horse 20 yards away. "I see you survived the attack. Fortunate." Thomas rose slowly, weapon trained on his superior officer. "Captain, what the hell is happening?" "Those weren't regular cavalry?" Caldwell dismounted with casual ease, hand resting on his sidearm. "Mexican traders and hired guns executing what military types call a false flag operation." Morning Star felt the world shifting as puzzle pieces fell into place. "You arranged this massacre?" "I arranged for a problem to be solved," Caldwell replied matter-of-factly. "The Comanche were never going to relocate voluntarily. This way, the territorial government gets what it wants, Mexican traders get water rights, and I get substantial compensation for facilitating the arrangement." Thomas's face had gone ashen. "You used me as a witness. When investigators come, I'll report the tribe was wiped out by Mexican raiders." "Exactly," Caldwell said, pleased. Thomas grasped the plan. "Your testimony carries more weight if you're emotionally invested. Hence my interest in reuniting you with your long-lost sister." Morning Star stared in horror as the full scope of his manipulation became clear. "The locket. You didn't just find us after the attack 15 years ago, you helped plan it." Caldwell's smile was winter cold. "I was young then, ambitious. Mexican traders offered good money for safe passage through Comanche territory. Your parents' wagon train provided convenient cover for establishing profitable relationships. You murdered our parents," Thomas whispered. "I facilitated business transactions," Caldwell corrected casually. "Same thing I'm doing now. Only difference is this time you're both old enough to appreciate the irony." Morning Star felt rage building like prairie fire. This man had orchestrated her birth family's destruction, shaped Thomas into a weapon against his own sister's people, and now planned to eliminate the last free Comanche for profit. "And the survivors," she said quietly. "Where are they?" Caldwell gestured toward distant rocks. "Mexican traders have them corralled, about a dozen mostly wounded. They're waiting for my signal to finish the job." "What signal?" Thomas asked, though his expression suggested he knew. "Elimination of the last witnesses," Caldwell replied, drawing his sidearm. "Neither of you can leave this desert alive." Morning Star's hand moved to her knife, useless against Caldwell's gun at this range. Beside her, Thomas raised his weapon, but Davies had his rifle trained on the lieutenant's back, another part of Caldwell's plan. "Davies," Thomas said without turning, "how long have you been working for him?" "Since Fort Riley, sir," the corporal replied steadily. "Captain Caldwell's been planning this for 2 years. The drought provided perfect opportunity." Morning Star's mind raced through limited options. They were outnumbered, outgunned, trapped in open ground. But looking toward the rocks where her people were held, she caught a glimpse of movement that might represent hope. Hawk Feather was among the prisoners positioned near the group's edge, with hands appearing only loosely bound. If she could create enough distraction. "Captain," she said, stepping forward with hands raised while calculating distances. "Before you kill us, I want to know about the other children from my family's wagon train. Were there others who survived?" Caldwell's eyes narrowed with suspicion, but curiosity seemed to win. 3 other families were traveling together. A few children survived, scattered to different fates. Some sold to Mexican buyers, others traded to various tribes. Your survival was pure chance, and you kept my mother's locket as insurance. Insurance. Caldwell agreed. I knew someday a survivor might resurface. Having proof of connection could be useful for control. Morning Star nodded, as if his explanation made sense. But she was really watching distant rocks where Hawk Feather had begun working free from his bonds. She needed more time. "There's something poetic about this moment," she said conversationally, taking another small step. "My birth brother and adoptive family, all dying because of the same man's greed. Poetic and profitable." Caldwell agreed. Water rights to this spring are worth more than a captain's salary for 10 years. It was then that Morning Star made her choice. She had spent her life balanced between worlds, never fully belonging to either. But facing the man who had destroyed both families, she finally understood what Singing Wolf meant about finding strength in both her bloods. "Thomas," she said quietly, not taking her eyes off Caldwell. "When I give the signal, shoot Davies first." "What signal?" Thomas whispered. Morning Star smiled grimly, hand moving toward the healing powder pouch at her belt, fine white dust that could blind a man if thrown properly. "You'll know." But before she could act, approaching horses filled the air again, accompanied by genuine cavalry trumpet calls. This time riders bore authentic U.S. Army colors, and at their head rode a figure that made Caldwell's face go white with alarm. Colonel Henderson had arrived with a full company, and his expression suggested he hadn't come to congratulate his subordinate. His presence changed everything, turning Caldwell's planned massacre into potential disaster. But Morning Star would soon discover that even the colonel's intervention might not be enough, because Caldwell had one more desperate card to play, and the stakes were about to become higher than anyone imagined. Colonel Henderson's voice cut across the desert like a cavalry saber as he surveyed the destroyed camp. Captain Caldwell explained this massacre immediately. Caldwell straightened to attention, but sweat beaded his forehead despite the morning chill. "Sir, the Comanche launched an unprovoked attack on a Mexican trading party. We arrived too late to prevent violence." "Interesting," Henderson replied, dryly dismounting, while his soldiers spread out in formation that suggested they were prepared for trouble. "Our scouts observed Mexican raiders attacking a peaceful Comanche camp, while you observed from a safe distance without intervening." Morning Star felt hope surge. If Henderson had witnessed the truth, perhaps justice was possible. But Caldwell was far from finished. "Colonel, I think you've been misinformed," the captain said smoothly. The situation required careful assessment before action. Lieutenant Morrison can confirm the hostile nature of the Comanche band. All eyes turned to Thomas, frozen between conflicting loyalties. Morning Star could see war playing out across his features, years of military conditioning against evidence of his own eyes and the blood tie he'd just discovered. "Lieutenant," Henderson prompted. Thomas looked at Morning Star, then at the camp ruins where her people had lived and died. When he spoke, his voice was steady, but heavy with emotion. "Sir, Captain Caldwell is lying. This was a planned massacre designed to appear as if Mexican raiders were responsible." The captain admitted his involvement to both myself and Miss Sarah Morrison, my sister. Henderson's eyebrows rose at this revelation, but he continued questioning with professional focus. "You're alleging Captain Caldwell orchestrated an attack on a Native American camp?" "Much more than that, sir," Thomas replied, resolve strengthening. I believe Captain Caldwell has been working with Mexican traders to eliminate Comanche presence so they can claim water rights. And I believe he was involved in my family's massacre 15 years ago. Caldwell's hand moved toward his sidearm, but found himself surrounded by Henderson's soldiers. The colonel's face had hardened into an expression promising swift justice. "Captain James Caldwell, you're under arrest for conspiracy, murder, and treason," Henderson announced formally, but as soldiers moved to restrain him, Caldwell made one last desperate play that revealed the true depths of his corruption. "Colonel, before you act on the word of a savage-raised woman and confused lieutenant, perhaps you should know the full scope of what you're interfering with," he said rapidly. "This operation has backing from territorial officials who've invested heavily in its success." Henderson paused, hand raised to halt his men. "Explain." "The Mexican government has offered substantial compensation for exclusive water rights." Caldwell said, words tumbling over each other. "Rights that will fund territorial expansion, railroad development, military improvements, all contingent on removing native presence. Mayauder, and you thought mass murder was acceptable to achieve those goals. I thought expedient action was preferable to prolonged siege, costing far more lives." Caldwell replied with fervor of someone who'd convinced himself of his righteousness. These people would never surrender voluntarily. This way, the problem is solved cleanly and profitably. Morning Star stepped forward, voice shaking with controlled rage. "Cleanly you call slaughtering children clean. Umric, I call it necessary." Caldwell shot back mask, finally slipping to reveal cold calculation beneath. "You want truth about your precious adoptive family? They weren't noble savages. They were raiders and killers who took what they wanted and left destruction behind." The accusation hung like funeral smoke. Morning Star felt familiar weight of being caught between worlds, but this time she had an answer born from 15 years of walking the line between peoples. "You're right," she said quietly. "The Comanche have raided and killed. They've taken captives, burned settlements, fought wars with anyone who threatened their way of life. Just like the cavalry has done. Just like Mexican traders have done. Just like you did to my birth family." She turned to address Henderson directly. "Sir, I won't pretend my adoptive people are innocent of all violence. But they're not monsters Captain Caldwell makes them out to be. They're human beings trying to survive in a world changing too fast for adaptation. They deserve better than extinction." Henderson nodded slowly. "Miss Morrison, where are the attack survivors?" Morning Star pointed toward the rock cluster where Hawk Feather and others were held. "About a dozen, mostly wounded. Mexican traders have them under guard. Lieutenant Morrison, take a squad and secure those prisoners," Henderson ordered. "I want them brought back alive and unharmed." As Thomas led the rescue party toward the rocks, Morning Star found herself alone with Henderson and the captured Caldwell. The colonel studied her face with careful attention of someone accustomed to reading character under pressure. "Miss Morrison," he said finally, "what would you have me do with the survivors? The territorial government will still demand relocation, and I have limited authority to countermand direct orders." Morning Star had been dreading this question, knowing that even Henderson's intervention might only delay the inevitable. But as she looked across the desert where her two families had intersected in violence and tragedy, an idea began forming, desperate, dangerous, but possibly their only chance. The colonel. What if there was another option? What if the surviving Comanche could disappear, entirely presumed dead in the attack? Henderson's eyes sharpened with interest. "Continue." The Mexican traders wanted the spring for profit. But what if they could be convinced it was unsuitable, contaminated, geologically unstable something that would make them abandon their plans? And the survivors. Morning Star took a deep breath, knowing her next words would determine everyone's fate. There are places in the deep desert where a small band could survive if they had someone to guide them who knew both the land and the outside world. Someone who could help them build a new life away from conflicts destroying the old ways. Henderson considered this for several long moments. Finally, he nodded slowly. "Miss Morrison, if you could guarantee the survivors would never again engage in raids against white settlers, I might be willing to officially report that all band members perished in the attack." "You would do that?" "I would do that for someone who has already sacrificed more than any person should have to sacrifice." Henderson replied with unexpected warmth. Before Morningstar could respond, gunfire erupted from the rock cluster with renewed intensity. The rescue party had encountered fierce resistance, and battle sounds echoed across the desert like thunder. But this time, something was different about the gunfire, something that made Caldwell smile. Despite his restraints, as if the shooting was proceeding exactly according to a plan, Morningstar didn't yet understand. As Henderson led his remaining soldiers toward the fight, Morningstar found herself running alongside them, heart pounding with knowledge that her brother was once again in mortal danger. But she was about to discover that Thomas wasn't the only one whose life hung in the balance, because Caldwell's trap had more layers than anyone realized, and the worst was yet to come. The battle at the rock cluster was chaos, incarnate gunsmoke and shouting voices, rifle cracks echoing off sandstone walls like deadly thunder. The Mexican traders caught between Thomas's rescue squad and Henderson's reinforcements fought with the desperation of men who knew surrender meant the gallows. But as Morningstar reached the scene, she realized this wasn't going according to any plan she understood. The traders weren't just defending themselves. They were executing something far more elaborate and deadly. "It's a trap," Thomas shouted from behind a boulder where return fire had pinned him down. "They've got the prisoners in the cave system. If we advance, they'll collapse the entrance." Morningstar's blood turned to ice as she spotted the real horror of Caldwell's contingency plan. Vasquez, the scarred trader leader, stood at the mouth of a narrow cave with Hawk Feather and the other Comanche survivors huddled behind him. But worse than the human shields was what she could see in his other hand, a lit torch held dangerously close to a line of black powder that snaked back into the cave darkness. "Stay back," Vasquez shouted in heavily accented English. "One step closer, and I light this fuse, cave comes down on all of them." Morningstar could see the tactical nightmare developing. The powder line wasn't just a threat to collapse the cave, it was positioned to bring down a section of the canyon wall that would crush anyone in the area below. Caldwell hadn't just planned to eliminate witnesses. He'd engineered a scenario where rescuing the prisoners would likely kill them along with their rescuers. "Thomas," she called out. "The powder line, it's not just for the cave. Look at the rock face above." Thomas followed her gaze and cursed as he spotted the carefully placed charges set into natural cracks in the sandstone. "Son of a bitch. If those go off, half the canyon comes down." Henderson had seen it too, his weathered face grim with understanding. "Withdrawal isn't an option. They'll detonate anyway once we're clear. And direct assault means everyone dies." Morningstar studied the scene with desperate intensity, her mind racing through possibilities that all seemed to end in disaster. That's when she noticed something the others had missed, a narrow ledge system running along the canyon wall that might, if someone was willing to risk everything, provide access to the cave from above. But reaching that ledge would require crossing open ground under direct fire, then climbing exposed rock face where one slip meant death. It was suicide. But it was also the only chance to reach the prisoners before Vasquez could light his fuse. "I'm going for the ledge," she told Thomas quietly. "Like hell you are. That's a death trap. Everything's a death trap right now." Morningstar replied, checking her knife and preparing to move. "But I'm the only one small enough to make that climb without being seen, and fast enough to reach them before—" Her words were cut off by a new sound that made everyone freeze, the distinctive whistle of an artillery shell arcing through the air. For a moment, Confusion reigned as everyone tried to identify the source. Then Morning Star spotted movement on the rim high above and understood with horrible clarity what was happening. Caldwell hadn't just planned a massacre and a cover-up. He'd arranged for artillery support from a second group of mercenaries positioned on the canyon rim, ready to eliminate everyone, Mexican traders, Comanche survivors, and inconvenient army witnesses alike, in one catastrophic bombardment that would leave no evidence of the conspiracy. "Artillery!" Henderson shouted. "Everyone find hard cover." The first shell struck the canyon floor 50 yards away, sending up a geyser of rock and sand that showered them with debris. The explosion's echo was still ringing when Morning Star made her decision. "Thomas, when the next shell hits, I'm going for the ledge," she said, not giving him time to argue. "If I don't make it tell Singing Wolf, I finally understood what she meant about choosing your own path." Sarah, no. But Morning Star was already moving, sprinting across open ground as the second artillery shell screamed overhead. She reached the rock face just as it exploded behind her, the blast wave lifting her off her feet and slamming her against the sandstone with enough force to drive the air from her lungs. For a moment, the world went gray around the edges. Then training kicked in, 15 years of Comanche conditioning that had taught her to move. When movement seemed impossible, to find handholds where none existed to climb. Like her life, and the lives of everyone she loved depended on reaching the top, which, as another shell whistled overhead, they absolutely did. The climb up the sheer rock face was a nightmare of loose stone and rifle fire from below. Morning Star's fingers found purchase in cracks, barely wide enough for fingertips, her moccasined feet seeking tiny ledges that crumbled under her weight. Each upward movement brought her closer to the cave entrance above, but also made her a clearer target for Vasquez's men. Bullets chipped stone inches from her face as she pressed herself against the rock, waiting for the third artillery shell to provide cover for the final push. When it came, a thunderous explosion that shook the entire canyon, she used the chaos to scramble up the last 20 feet and roll onto the narrow ledge that ran along the cave mouth. Inside the cave, she could hear Hawk Feather's voice speaking in rapid Comanche to the other prisoners, his tone calm, despite their desperate situation. He was telling them to be ready to move quickly when the moment came, to trust that the spirits hadn't brought them this far to abandon them now. Morning Star crept toward the cave entrance, her knife ready, but her mind focused on the real problem, that powder line snaking back into the darkness. She needed to cut it before Vasquez could light the fuse, but doing so would require getting past him first. That's when she heard something that made her blood run cold. Vasquez wasn't alone in the cave. Another voice was speaking, and she recognized it with sick certainty. "Light it now," Corporal Davies was saying. "The artillery will provide perfect cover. Everyone dies, no witnesses, and we collect our payment from the Mexicans for eliminating the Comanche problem permanently." "What about the soldiers below?" Vasquez asked. "Acceptable losses," Davies replied with chilling indifference. Captain Caldwell's orders were clear: nobody survives to testify about this operation. Morning Star realized with horror that Davies wasn't just Caldwell's accomplice. He was the operation's failsafe, positioned to ensure that even if everything else went wrong, all the witnesses would still die. The young corporal she'd thought was nervous and inexperienced was actually a cold-blooded killer tasked with murder on a massive scale. She could see them now, through the cave entrance, Davies with a rifle trained on the Comanche prisoners, while Vasquez held his torch over the powder fuse. Between them, Hawk Feather and 11 other survivors, huddled in the cave's depths, wounded and exhausted, but still alive. Still worth saving. Morning Star made her choice. She burst through the cave entrance like an avenging spirit, her war cry echoing off stone walls as she drove her knife toward Davies' back. But the corporal was faster than she'd expected, spinning to meet her attack with trained reflexes that spoke of considerable combat experience. The knife blade scraped along his rifle barrel instead of finding flesh, and Davies's return blow sent her sprawling across the cave floor. But her attack had accomplished what she'd hoped. Vasquez had dropped his torch in surprise, and the flame had gone out before it could reach the powder fuse. "Kill her," Davies shouted, working the bolt on his rifle. "Kill her and light the fuse." But Hawk Feather had been waiting for exactly this moment. Despite his wounds, the Comanche warrior launched himself at Vasquez with the fluid grace of someone who had spent a lifetime turning desperate situations to his advantage. The two men crashed into the cave wall, fighting for control of a pistol that could end everything with a single shot. Morning Star rolled away from Davies's rifle fire, the bullet striking sparks from stone where her head had been a moment before. She came up in a crouch, her knife ready, but knew she was outmatched in close combat against someone with Davies's training and reach. That's when the fourth artillery shell struck the canyon rim directly above them. The explosion was so close that it felt like the hand of an angry god, reaching down to shake the very foundations of the earth. The cave ceiling cracked, raining stone dust and debris on everyone inside. But more importantly, the blast had destabilized the mercenaries' artillery position. Morning Star could hear shouting from above as equipment and men tumbled down the canyon face. In the confusion that followed, she made her final gambit. "Thomas!" she shouted at the top of her lungs, hoping her voice would carry over the chaos. "The powder line runs to the back of the cave. If you can create a distraction, I can cut it." She didn't wait to see if he'd heard her. Instead, she threw herself across the cave toward the black powder line, knowing that Davies would have to choose between shooting her and maintaining control of the prisoners. He chose to shoot. The rifle bullet caught her in the shoulder, spinning her around and sending her crashing into the cave wall. Pain exploded through her body like liquid fire. But her knife hand was still working, still reaching for the powder line that represented death for everyone she loved. Her fingers closed around the black cord just as Davies chambered another round. But before he could fire again, the sound of approaching bootfalls echoed from the cave entrance. Thomas and his men finally able to advance, now that the artillery threat had been neutralized. Davies spun toward the new threat, giving Morning Star the opening she needed. With her last conscious effort, she drew the knife blade across the powder line, severing it cleanly, just as Davies' second shot rang out. The bullet missed her by inches, striking stone where she had been falling. But it didn't matter anymore. The powder line was cut, the immediate threat eliminated, and she could hear Thomas's voice calling her name as darkness closed in around the edges of her vision. The last thing she saw before unconsciousness claimed her was Hawk Feather standing over Vasquez's motionless form, alive and unharmed, despite everything Caldwell had done to destroy them all. They had won. At a cost that might prove too high to bear, but they had won. Morning Star drifted back to consciousness 3 days later in a makeshift medical tent, the taste of willow bark tea strong on her tongue and the scent of sage smoke telling her that Singing Wolf was nearby. Her shoulder throbbed with each heartbeat, but she was alive, and that was more than she'd dared hope for when Davies' bullet found its mark. "Easy, daughter." Singing Wolf's voice came from somewhere to her left. "The Army surgeon says the bullet passed cleanly through, but you lost much blood. You need rest." Morning Star tried to sit up and immediately regretted the decision as pain lanced through her shoulder like liquid fire. The others, Hawk, Feather, Thomas, all alive thanks to your foolishness and courage. Singing Wolf replied, but her tone held warmth despite the scolding words. "Hawk Feather has a concussion and some interesting stories about fighting in caves. Your brother hasn't left this tent for more than a few minutes since they brought you here." As if summoned by her words, Thomas appeared in the tent entrance, his uniform dirty and his face showing 3 days of worry and sleepless nights. When he saw that she was awake, relief flooded his features like sunrise after the longest night. "Sarah," he said, using her birth name for the first time since they'd been reunited. "How do you feel?" "Like I've been shot," Morning Star replied with a weak smile. "But I'll live." "What happened to Davies and Vasquez?" Thomas's expression darkened. "Vasquez is dead. Hawk Feather made sure of that. Davies." He paused, struggling with something. "Davies is in military custody, but there's something you need to know about him." Morning Star waited, reading the pain in her brother's eyes. "His real name is David Morrison," Thomas said quietly. "He's our cousin, Uncle William's son. He was working with Caldwell because our family apparently had debts, gambling obligations that Caldwell offered to clear in exchange for inside information and cooperation." The revelation hit Morning Star like a physical blow. Their own blood relative had been willing to see them murdered for money, had been part of the conspiracy that destroyed their birth family and nearly eliminated her adoptive one. "Family," she whispered bitterly. "Blood doesn't guarantee loyalty, does it?" "No," Thomas agreed, settling beside her sleeping furs. "But it doesn't guarantee betrayal either. What you did in that cave, what you've done throughout this entire nightmare, that's family too. That's what family should be." Before Morning Star could respond, Colonel Henderson appeared in the tent entrance, his weathered face showing the strain of recent events, but also something that might have been relief. "Miss Morrison," he said formally, "I'm glad to see you recovering. If you're feeling up to it, there are some matters we need to discuss regarding the future of the survivors." Morning Star struggled to sit up despite the pain, knowing that this conversation would determine everything that came after. "What kind of matters, Colonel?" Henderson glanced around the tent, then spoke in lower tones. "The official report will list all members of Chief Broken Arrow's band as casualties of the Mexican raid. Captain Caldwell died resisting arrest, a detail that saves everyone the complications of a public trial. The Mexican traders have been scattered, their water rights claims invalidated. And unofficially, 13 people died in that massacre, and 13 ghosts have apparently found their way to some very remote canyons where the territorial authorities have no interest in looking for them." Henderson replied with the faintest suggestion of a smile, assuming, of course, that these ghosts never again trouble white settlements or give anyone reason to believe they might exist. Morning Star understood the offer being made: freedom in exchange for invisibility, survival purchased with the promise to disappear from the world that wanted them dead. It was more than she had dared hope for, but it also meant giving up any chance of living openly in either of the worlds that had shaped her. "Colonel," she said carefully, "what would happen if someone wanted to guide these hypothetical ghosts to their new home? Someone who understood both their needs and the outside world's expectations." Henderson's expression grew thoughtful. "Such a person would need to be very careful, very discreet. They would need to understand that once they made that choice, there would be no going back to their old life." Thomas leaned forward, his face intense with sudden understanding. "Sarah, what are you thinking?" Morning Star looked at her brother, seeing in his eyes the same recognition that had been growing in her own heart. "I'm thinking that some choices make themselves. That maybe the spirits didn't bring us back together just so we could be separated again by the demands of worlds that don't really want either of us." The silence that followed was heavy with possibility and the weight of decisions that would reshape all their lives. Finally, Thomas spoke with quiet certainty that surprised them all. "Colonel Henderson, I'd like to request a discharge from active duty." Henderson's eyebrows rose. "Lieutenant, you have a promising career ahead of you. Are you certain you want to abandon that for an uncertain future in the wilderness?" "I'm certain I want to be with my family," Thomas replied simply. "Both families. I've spent 8 years serving an institution that would have ordered me to kill my own sister if I'd followed orders without question. It's time I served something more worthy of loyalty." Morning Star felt tears threatening to spill over as the last of her old doubts finally settled into peace. Together. Thomas confirmed, and the word carried all the weight of family choice and the bridges they would build between worlds that had seemed destined for eternal conflict. Colonel Henderson studied them both for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "I'll have the discharge papers prepared. And Miss Morrison, if you should happen to encounter any ghosts in your travels, You might tell them that certain territorial officials have recently developed a strong interest in railroad development far to the north. The deep desert is expected to remain uninteresting to official attention for the foreseeable future. As Henderson left the tent, Morning Star felt something settle in her chest that she had never experienced before. The deep, abiding peace of someone who had finally found her true home, not in a place or with a people, but in the courage to choose love over fear, family over duty, and hope over the bitter inheritance of old hatreds. 6 months later, the hidden canyon had been transformed into something unprecedented, a place where Comanche healing wisdom merged with military engineering knowledge, where traditional lodge construction incorporated innovations learned from Army field manuals, where children grew up speaking 3 languages and learning to navigate multiple ways of understanding the world. Morning Star stood on a narrow ledge overlooking the canyon floor, watching Thomas, now known to the band as Two Worlds, teach a group of teenage boys how to construct irrigation channels that would make their terraced gardens more efficient. His cavalry uniform had been replaced by practical clothing that mixed Comanche designs with frontier durability, and his bearing had lost the rigid formality of military training without sacrificing any of his natural authority. He has found his place, Singing Wolf said, appearing beside her with the silent grace that had made her such an effective scout in younger days. As have you, daughter. Morning Star nodded her hand, moving unconsciously to touch the small scar on her shoulder where Davy's bullet had passed through. The wound had healed cleanly, leaving behind only a reminder of the price she had been willing to pay for the chance to build something better than what had come before. The children are thriving, she observed, watching as a mixed group of Comanche and Mexican refugee children played together in the afternoon sun. Word of their sanctuary had spread quietly through networks of displaced people who moved like shadows through the borderlands, bringing them new members who needed a place where old rules didn't apply. Necker and the adults are learning that survival requires adaptation. Singing Wolf replied, Your brother's knowledge of white technology has made our water supplies more reliable, while our knowledge of desert survival has kept him from making mistakes that would have gotten us all killed. It was true. The combination of Comanche wisdom and military training had created something that existed nowhere else, a community that could remain hidden from territorial authorities, while building sustainable life in one of the harshest environments on the continent. They had faced challenges that would have destroyed a less adaptable group, but each crisis had only strengthened their bonds and improved their ability to work together. There's something else, Singing Wolf said, her tone becoming more serious. A rider approached under a white flag this morning. He carried a message from Colonel Henderson. Morning Star felt a chill that had nothing to do with the evening air. What kind of message? The territorial government has officially closed the investigation into the incident at Fort Brazos. Captain Caldwell's conspiracy has been exposed, and the Mexican trader's water rights claims have been invalidated, and the sacred spring has been declared a federal preserve, where no commercial development will be allowed. The news should have been purely good, but Morning Star caught something in Singing Wolf's expression that suggested complications. But the colonel also warned that there are rumors about survivor stories told by traders and travelers about strange lights in hidden canyons and impossible gardens in the deep desert. He believes we are safe for now, but cannot guarantee that others won't eventually come looking. Morning Star absorbed this information with the calm that came from months of facing impossible challenges and finding ways to overcome them. Then we'll need to be ready for that possibility. It's time to discuss our options with the council. That evening, the council meeting brought together voices that would never have been heard in the same room under any other circumstances. Hawk Feather spoke with the authority of traditional Comanche leadership, while Thomas contributed insights gained from years of military planning and frontier experience. Maria Sandoval, a Mexican woman who had fled north with her children after her husband was killed in cross-border raids, offered perspectives on trade networks and supply routes that could keep them connected to the outside world without compromising their security. The question before us is simple, Morningstar said, as the discussion reached its crucial point. Do we remain hidden and hope the outside world forgets we exist? Or do we find ways to engage selectively, building relationships that can help us grow while protecting what we've created? Hiding has kept us alive this long, Hawk Feather pointed out, with the caution of someone who had seen too many good plans destroyed by overconfidence. Why risk exposure now? Because hiding means we can never grow beyond what we are. Thomas replied his words, carrying the weight of someone who had given up everything to be part of this experiment. Our children deserve the chance to choose their own futures, not just survive in isolation. The debate continued late into the night, touching on questions of identity, security, growth, and the fundamental challenge of maintaining their unique culture while adapting to a changing world. In the end, they reached a decision that reflected the community they had become: cautious but not paralyzed, traditional but not rigid, unified but not uniform. They would remain hidden, but they would also begin building carefully selected relationships with the outside world. Trusted traders would be allowed to visit under strict conditions, bringing news and supplies in exchange for the unique crafts and innovations their community had developed. Children would learn about the wider world while remaining grounded in the values that had shaped their sanctuary. Most importantly, they would document their story not for government officials who would use it to justify new policies, but for future generations who might need to understand that there had once been a place where different peoples had chosen cooperation over conflict, where the bridge between worlds had been built with patience and sacrifice rather than conquest and submission. As the meeting ended and people drifted back to their homes, Morningstar found herself standing once again at the edge of the canyon, looking up at stars that seemed brighter here than anywhere else she had ever been. Thomas joined her in the comfortable silence they had learned to share, two people who had found their way back to each other across 15 years of separation and pain. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked quietly. "Giving up your career, your rank, everything you worked so hard to achieve?" Thomas was quiet for so long that she thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice carried certainty that surprised them both. "I regret the years we lost," he said. "I regret that it took violence and death to bring us back together. I regret that our parents never got to see what we became. But regret this." He gestured toward the canyon where their people were building something unprecedented. "Never. This is the life our parents would have wanted for us together, free and working to build something better than what we inherited." Morningstar smiled, feeling the last of her old doubts finally settling into peace. "Then we'll make sure their sacrifice wasn't wasted. We'll make sure this place survives and grows no matter what challenges we face. Together." Thomas agreed, and the word carried all the weight of family choice and the bridges they had built between worlds that had once seemed destined for eternal conflict. 2 years later, a lone rider approached the ruins of Fort Brazos, carrying dispatches from the territorial capital in Santa Fe. Carlos Mendoza was a young Mexican vaquero whose family had ranched in the region for 3 generations, and he knew every stream and spring for 50 miles in any direction. His mission was routine: deliver messages to the post commander and return with reports on territorial security. What he found instead was abandonment and mystery. The military post had been closed following the investigation into Captain Caldwell's activities, and the buildings now stood empty except for wind and the occasional coyote seeking shelter from the desert sun. Weeds grew between adobe bricks, and sand had drifted against walls in patterns that spoke of years without human maintenance. Carlos was curious by nature, and when he discovered the fort's abandonment, he took time to explore the empty buildings. In what had once been the post commander's office, he found a thick folder of documents scattered across the desk, reports, maps, and correspondence related to the Caldwell investigation that had been left behind when the last soldiers departed. Most of the papers meant nothing to him, but one item caught his attention, a hand-drawn map showing water sources throughout the region, with particular attention to a series of canyons marked as Comanche Territory Avoid. Some of the water sources marked were familiar to him, but others were shown in areas where he had never thought to look. Intrigued by the possibility of discovering new springs that could benefit his family's ranch, he decided to investigate one of the marked locations during his return journey to Santa Fe. What he found there changed his understanding of what had really happened at Fort Brazos. The canyon was narrow and well concealed, accessible only through a crack in the sandstone that would be invisible to anyone who didn't know exactly where to look. But inside, Carlos discovered clear evidence of recent habitation fire rings, shelter frameworks, and tool marks that suggested ongoing human presence. More surprising still were the terraced gardens carved into the canyon walls, an ingenious irrigation system that channeled seasonal runoff to support crops that should not have been able to survive in the desert climate. Someone with considerable knowledge of both Comanche survival techniques and Mexican agricultural methods had designed this hidden sanctuary with remarkable skill. As Carlos explored further, he came upon a small shrine built into a natural alcove in the rock wall. The shrine contained objects from multiple cultures, Comanche prayer feathers, a cavalry officer's insignia, that had been carefully bent into the shape of a peace symbol, and a small silver locket that had been placed among offerings of corn pollen and sage. Beside the shrine, carved into the stone with painstaking precision, was an inscription in 3 languages, English, Spanish, and what Carlos assumed was Comanche. Here rest the spirits of all who died for water and hatred. Here begins the peace they could not find in life. May their children walk in both worlds without fear, and may love prove stronger than the wounds of history. Below the inscription were 2 names, Morning Star Broken Arrow and Thomas Two Worlds. Carlos stood in the hidden canyon for a long time, trying to piece together the story the evidence told. According to official reports, all members of Chief Broken Arrow's band had perished in the Mexican raid. But the shrine, the gardens, and the ongoing signs of habitation suggested a very different outcome. One that spoke of survival adaptation and the possibility of building something new from the ashes of destruction. As he prepared to leave the canyon, Carlos noticed movement on the rim high above. For just a moment, he caught sight of 2 figures silhouetted against the sky, a woman with long blonde braids and a man in clothes that mixed cavalry blue with Comanche beadwork. They stood watching him with calm dignity, neither threatening nor welcoming, simply acknowledging his presence with the bearing of people who had chosen their own path and were prepared to defend it. Between them stood a small child, perhaps 5 years old, with hair that caught the light like spun gold and skin that spoke of mixed heritage. The child waved at Carlos with the innocent friendliness of someone who had never learned to fear strangers. Then they were gone, vanished into the maze of canyons and mesas like spirits of the desert itself. Carlos remounted his horse and continued his journey to Santa Fe. But he carried the memory of that moment with him, like a secret too precious to share with anyone who might not understand its true value. When he reached the territorial capital, he made his routine delivery of dispatches but said nothing about his discovery in the hidden canyon. Some secrets, he decided, were too important to entrust to government officials who would see only problems to be solved rather than miracles to be protected. Among the papers he carried was a letter that had been meant for Fort Brazos from a Mexican trading company. The water rights to the sacred spring have been deemed economically unviable due to federal preservation status and reported geological instability. We are withdrawing our claim and redirecting our investment to other projects. Please inform the territorial authorities that Mexican commercial interests in the region have been permanently terminated. Carlos smiled as he read the letter, understanding that someone had been very clever about convincing the traders that their prize was worthless. Someone who understood both the value of water in the desert and the greed that drove men to kill for it. He burned the letter that night, watching the flames consume what might have been the final chapter in a story of violence and loss. But as the smoke rose toward the stars, Carlos preferred to think of it as the epilogue to a story of survival and hope. Somewhere in the hidden canyons of the deep desert, the last free Comanche lived according to their own laws, guided by a woman who had found strength in both her bloods and protected by a man who had chosen justice over duty. They had disappeared from the official records, but they lived on in the only way that truly mattered, free to determine their own destiny in a world that had tried to destroy them. The sacred spring at Fort Brazos remained empty and unused, its waters flowing unclaimed into the desert sand where they had always belonged. But in the hidden places where only the wind and the eagles could find them, another spring sustained life and hope for those who had learned that sometimes the greatest victory is simply the chance to survive with dignity intact. Morning Star, Broken Arrow, and Thomas Two Worlds had kept their promise to build something new from the pieces of what was broken. In doing so, they had written the final chapter of their family's story, not with blood and surrender, but with wisdom and the courage to disappear into legend rather than submit to a system that would have destroyed everything they valued. The desert kept their secret as it had kept secrets for countless generations before them. And in the hidden canyons where they had found sanctuary, their children, both born and adopted Comanche and Mexican and mixed blood, would grow up knowing both worlds but belonging fully to the one they had chosen to create together. A place where the color of your skin mattered less than the content of your character, where the language of your prayers was less important than the sincerity of your faith, and where family was defined not by blood alone, but by the willingness to sacrifice everything for those you loved. The bridge between worlds had been built one careful stone at a time by people who refused to accept that hatred was stronger than hope, or that the past had to determine the future. In their hidden sanctuary, Morning Star and Thomas had proven that sometimes the most revolutionary act is simply choosing to love your enemy's children as your own, and to build tomorrow with materials salvaged from yesterday's failures. And in the end, that was enough. That was everything.